When Mark and Olivia Whitaker first laid eyes on the charming Beverly Hills estate once owned by Debbie Reynolds, it felt like fate. The house had an old Hollywood elegance arched doorways, vintage chandeliers, and a sunken living room that whispered of glamorous parties long gone. It wasn't the biggest or most extravagant property in the area, but it had history, and Olivia, a lifelong film enthusiast, had fallen in love the moment they stepped inside. They weren't even looking to buy. Mark, a finance consultant, had only humored Olivia's curiosity about the home when she found it listed online. But something about the house drew them in. The air smelled faintly of lavender, a scent Olivia associated with her grandmother. It was cozy, almost welcoming. By the end of their first visit, they had made an offer. The realtor, an older woman named Elaine, hesitated before handing them the keys on closing day. "You know the stories, right?" she asked, giving them a knowing smile. Mark raised an eyebrow. "What stories?" Elaine hesitated. "Well, people say the house is lively. Strange noises, cold spots. The usual ghost stories." She chuckled, but her eyes betrayed something else: reluctance, maybe even concern. Mark rolled his eyes. "We've lived in New York apartments. I think we can handle a creaky old house." Olivia, though, felt a flicker of unease. She loved ghost stories, but she never thought she'd be living in one. That first night, they celebrated with champagne, toasting to their new home as city lights shimmered in the distance. The house was quiet, aside from the occasional pop and groan of settling wood. Olivia wandered through the dimly lit halls, running her fingers over the delicate floral wallpaper. She imagined Debbie Reynolds gliding through these very halls in a silk robe, humming a tune from Singin' in the Rain. Then, just as she was about to turn in for the night, she heard it. Soft humming. Not from a radio. Not from Mark, who was already in bed. Came from down the hall. The hairs on her arms prickled as she slowly turned toward the sound. A melody, faint but familiar. The same tune she had just been thinking about. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Maybe it was just her imagination. Or maybe they weren't as alone in this house as they thought. The humming had stopped the moment Olivia turned her head toward the dark hallway. She stood there, barefoot on the cool hardwood floor, her fingers grazing the smooth banister of the staircase. The air in the house felt different. Not oppressive, not menacing, just charged, as if something unseen had been disrupted. She swallowed hard, listening. The silence stretched out, pressing against her ears like cotton. The hum had been real. It hadn't come from outside. There were no open windows, no passing cars playing old tunes, and certainly no neighbors singing at this hour. It had been inside the house, just down the hallway, as if someone were standing there, lost in a moment from decades past. Olivia exhaled, shaking off the chill creeping up her spine. "You're just tired," she whispered to herself. Maybe the excitement of moving, the champagne, the history of the place, maybe it was all playing tricks on her mind. She forced herself to turn away, retreating into the bedroom where Mark was already asleep, his body half buried under the thick duvet. The room was warm, a stark contrast to the hallway, and as she slipped into bed beside him, she told herself that was all it had been, a trick of the mind. But in the morning, she found something she couldn't explain. The house was quiet when she woke. Mark had gone for his usual early run, leaving the lingering scent of his aftershave in the air. Olivia stretched, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and wandered into the kitchen. The sun streamed through the large bay windows, casting golden light over the marble countertops. Everything looked normal except for the teacup sitting neatly on the table. It was porcelain, delicate, with tiny pink roses painted around its rim. It hadn't been there last night. Olivia was sure of it. They had unpacked their kitchen essentials just before bed, and this was not one of their cups. It looked old, far older than anything she owned. The edges were slightly worn, as if someone had used it lovingly for years. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for it. The porcelain was ice cold. A chill slid down her spine, but she forced herself to stay rational. Maybe Mark had found it in one of the cabinets. Maybe he'd placed it there absent-mindedly before his run. That was logical. That made sense. But as she turned to the sink, she noticed something else. The scent of lavender. Not faint, like an old perfume lingering in the walls. No, this was fresh, like someone had just been there moments before she walked in. She backed out of the kitchen slowly, her bare feet making no sound against the polished floor. The house still felt quiet, undisturbed, yet something gnawed at the edges of her senses. That's when the light flickered. Not all of them, just the one above the table, the one right over the teacup. It dimmed, buzzed softly, then steadied again. She inhaled sharply. "Okay," she muttered under her breath. "That's enough." She grabbed her phone and texted Mark. "Did you put a teacup on the table this morning?" The response came within seconds. "What teacup?" Olivia's pulse quickened. She glanced back at the delicate piece of porcelain, its roses still vibrant despite their faded edges. Something told her it had always been here. She just hadn't noticed it before. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The teacup remained exactly where she had left it, untouched, as the day stretched on. Olivia tried to ignore it, to let the rational part of her mind explain it away. Maybe it had been in a cabinet and somehow fallen out. Maybe Mark had put it there and forgotten. Maybe, just maybe, there was a perfectly good reason for its presence. But the weight of it, the cold smoothness of the porcelain in her hands, the way it seemed to belong in the house more than she did it, unsettled her. By evening, she was exhausted, her mind worn from the lingering thoughts she couldn't shake. Mark had dismissed the teacup when he got home, chuckling as he turned it over in his hands. "It's probably been here for years," he said. "Maybe it was Debbie's. A little souvenir from the past." A souvenir. The thought didn't comfort Olivia as much as it should have. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock down the hall. The house settled with small creaks and groans, but something about it felt too deliberate, like someone shifting their weight just outside the bedroom door. Then came the rustling, soft at first, a whisper of fabric moving against fabric. Olivia's breath hitched. She turned her head slowly, peering into the darkness beyond the bed. A shadow moved near the vanity. She shot upright, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Mark!" she hissed, shaking his shoulder. He grumbled, turning over. "What?" "There's something." But as she looked again, there was nothing. Just the dim outline of the vanity, the mirror reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Nothing had changed. Nothing had moved. Yet she swore she had seen it. A flicker of a figure just for a second, standing there. And then, as if to confirm the unease twisting in her stomach, the scent of lavender filled the room once again. The next morning, Olivia avoided talking about the night before. She didn't want Mark rolling his eyes at her again. Didn't want another half-hearted, "Maybe it's just your imagination." Instead, she threw herself into making the house feel like theirs. She unpacked books, arranged photographs, set up little corners of comfort, a soft throw on the couch, a vase of fresh peonies in the foyer. She wanted to erase the feeling that the house was waiting for someone else to return. But as she worked, little things kept happening. A door left ajar that she swore she had closed. The faint clink of glassware in the kitchen when she was in the living room. And always that scent. That floral, powdery perfume that seemed to drift in and out, never lingering long enough to be solid, but never completely fading. By the third day, she couldn't ignore it anymore. She sat at the dining table, staring at the teacup, turning it over in her hands. "Who are you?" she whispered, feeling ridiculous even as she said it aloud. The silence in the house deepened, and then, somewhere down the hall, a soft sigh. Not the house settling, not the wind, a human sigh, a sound so quiet, so filled with something longing, that Olivia felt her entire body go cold. She wasn't alone, and whoever was here, whoever had always been here, was trying to tell her something. Olivia didn't move. She sat frozen at the dining table, her fingers curled around the porcelain teacup, her breathing shallow. The sigh had been unmistakable, soft, weary, almost sorrowful. The house was listening. The realization crept over her like a slow-moving shadow, filling every corner of her mind. She had always believed that old houses carried something with them: memories, energy, echoes of those who had walked their halls before. But believing was one thing. Feeling it was another. A floorboard creaked somewhere beyond the kitchen. A single, deliberate step. Then silence. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She strained to listen, to pick apart the ordinary sounds of the house from something more unnatural. Nothing. And yet, the air felt charged again, thick with something unseen, something just beyond reach. The scent of lavender was stronger now, no longer a passing wisp but a presence in the room, wrapping around her like a whisper of old perfume. She forced herself to stand, her chair scraping softly against the hardwood. "Mark!" Her voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. She already knew there wouldn't be. She took slow, careful steps toward the hallway, her bare feet making no sound. The house had grown colder. The doorway to the study stood open just as she had left it earlier in the afternoon. Sunlight slanted through the window, casting long golden streaks across the floor. The desk was neat, untouched. The bookshelves were lined with old hardcovers, some of them left behind by the previous owner. And there, by the window, was the chair. It hadn't moved. It was still in its place. An old tufted armchair with faded fabric and slightly worn armrests. But it felt occupied. Not visibly. Not in any way she could explain. But the air around it was different. Heavy. Like someone had just been sitting there, watching her. She swallowed against the dryness in her throat. A picture frame stood on the windowsill, its glass slightly dusty from years of being undisturbed. She reached for it with a trembling hand. It was an old black and white photograph. Debbie Reynolds, smiling, seated in what looked like a dressing room. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her expression warm and full of life. The moment Olivia touched the frame, the temperature in the room dropped. And then, a rustling behind her, a whisper of fabric. She turned sharply, heart pounding, expecting. What? A figure? A shadow? Something standing there in the doorway, watching her with unseen eyes? But the room was empty. The house, however, felt awake. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't hostile. But it remembered. And it wasn't letting go. The house was awake. Olivia could feel it like a slow exhale against the nape of her neck, like the gentle pressure of unseen fingertips brushing over her skin. It wasn't malevolent. No icy grip, no sudden crash of objects thrown in anger. But it was there, surrounding her, watching. She gripped the picture frame in her hands, her fingertips leaving smudges on the glass. Debbie Reynolds' warm smile stared back at her, frozen in time. The light in the study shifted as the sun dipped lower, casting long, slanted shadows against the bookshelves. The air smelled faintly of old paper and something sweeter underneath: powdery, floral, lavender. The scent was everywhere now. A sudden creak behind her. Olivia turned, pulse stammering, eyes flicking toward the hallway. Nothing. No shifting shadows, no movement. But she felt it. The weight of presence. The house was listening. A deep breath. Another step forward. She moved slowly, deliberately, letting her fingers graze the old wooden desk, as if grounding herself. The walls held their silence, but she swore she could hear something, an undercurrent of sound, too soft to be fully realized. A whisper. Not words, not distinct, but a cadence. A presence shifting just beyond the veil of understanding. The lavender scent thickened, pressing against her senses, wrapping around her like invisible arms. And then, a faint hum. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. A ghostly thread of melody floating through the air, so delicate she almost doubted her own ears. But it was real. The same song she had heard the first night in the house. The same tune she had been thinking of when she stood in the hallway. Singin' in the rain. She didn't move. She barely breathed. The melody lingered, then faded into the silence, leaving only the steady thrum of her heartbeat in her ears. Her throat tightened. "Who are you?" she whispered. The house did not answer, but something did. A movement, just a flicker, caught at the very edge of her vision. The vanity mirror. Her breath hitched as she turned slowly. The reflection wavered, not like a trick of light, not like the distortion of old glass. No, this was different. It shimmered. A shape. A woman just barely there, an impression against the fabric of reality. Soft, almost translucent curls, a glint of light catching against what might have been sequins or silk, and the eyes gentle, knowing, filled with something Olivia couldn't name. Not a figure, not a ghost, an imprint, a memory playing itself over and over. Then, in the span of a blink, it was gone. Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands trembled. She set the picture frame down on the desk, her heartbeat steadying in slow, uneven pulses. She should have been afraid. She should have run, shaken Mark awake, called anyone to make sense of what was happening. But instead, she whispered, barely audible, "I see you." And for the first time, the house felt calm, like it had been waiting for someone to listen. The air in the study remained heavy, thick with the fading traces of something unseen. Olivia stood motionless, her fingers still hovering over the picture frame, her pulse slowing, but not by much. The house was listening. The house had always been listening. She let out a slow, measured breath, barely aware of her own movements as she stepped back into the hallway. The wooden floors were cool beneath her feet, each step pressing softly into the past. It was no longer just a house. It was a vessel, filled with echoes, filled with moments that had refused to fade. As she walked, something changed. The lighting shifted, though not dramatically, just enough to feel different, warmer, softer, as if the air itself carried the glow of another time, one that did not belong to her. She reached the staircase, paused. From somewhere beyond the hallway, a sound so subtle, so delicate, it almost didn't belong in the waking world. A fabric brushing against a doorway, a heel tapping lightly against the floor, a movement just out of sight. Olivia turned her head slowly. The hallway stretched before her, darkening as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon. At the very end of it, near the entrance to the master bedroom, the air shimmered again. It wasn't an image this time, not a figure, just a presence, a shape without form, a memory without structure, hovering just outside the edge of perception. Olivia swallowed hard, but she didn't step back. The lavender scent deepened. It wasn't just perfume anymore. It was something layered, something with weight. Powder and roses, a trace of hairspray, the warmth of a dressing room, a place where hands had once fastened sequins, where soft humming had once filled the quiet spaces between performances. The realization settled over Olivia with a strange, aching clarity. This wasn't just a ghost. This was a house that had been loved. The walls weren't haunted by something seeking revenge, nor by something trapped in torment. It wasn't the kind of haunting that came with poltergeist activity or terror-filled nights. No, this was different. This was something left behind because it could not bear to leave. A presence that lingered, not out of malice, but out of devotion. The scent faded slightly, but the air still hummed. The house was watching, waiting, for what Olivia wasn't sure. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, touching the cool wooden frame of the staircase railing. She thought of the old Hollywood stories, the legends, the whispers about stars who never truly left the places they loved. She thought of Debbie Reynolds, of the way she had fought for her collection of film history, of how she had spent her life preserving a world that was fading away. And now, Olivia realized, this house, the one place Reynolds had called home until the very end, was holding on to something, too. Something more than just memories. Something alive in the walls, in the air, in the whispers of old melodies that still drifted through the halls. A love so strong that even time couldn't erase it. A house that would not forget. Olivia exhaled, barely aware that she had been holding her breath. The presence in the hallway remained, lingering just at the edges of sight, no longer trying to scare her, just waiting to be understood. And for the first time since she had stepped into this house, Olivia no longer wanted to run. She wanted to listen. The presence never left. Not fully, but it changed. In the days that followed, Olivia no longer felt watched with an unfamiliar gaze. The house still whispered soft hums in the night, the distant clink of teacups, the faint scent of lavender, but it was no longer unsettling. It was comforting, like a memory that refused to fade, a presence that did not demand fear, but simply wanted to be acknowledged. Mark never noticed it the way she did. He laughed when she mentioned the humming, the lingering perfume. Maybe you just wanted to be haunted, he teased, pressing a kiss to her forehead. But Olivia knew better. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the house settled into quiet, she stood by the vanity in their bedroom, fingers ghosting over the delicate porcelain of the teacup that had appeared that first morning. She lifted it, held it gently, then softly, she whispered, "I see you." For the first time, the air felt lighter. The house sighed, not with sorrow, not with longing, but with something like gratitude. And from that night on, the house did not feel empty. It felt loved, just as it always had been, just as it always would be. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.